Somehow, nearly a month has passed since the Bradley Beal trade to the Phoenix Suns. On today's episode of Locked On Suns, we break down all things Beal. Where is he at in his career? What might his role be in Phoenix? And how might he evolve his game on a championship caliber team? Let's go.
You are Locked On Suns, your daily Phoenix Suns podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And we're back. This is Locked On Phoenix Suns. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Brendon Kleen, a credentialed media member covering the Suns for the past 6 seasons, a writer at Suns.com, and the host of the Just Basketball Show, wherever you get your podcast. Thank you for making Locked On Suns your first listen to close out the week. A very hot week in the Valley. Maybe you're not here. Maybe you are. Either way, the offseason continues, and we're here for you every single day. We're free and available on all platforms. All you have to do is search Locked On Suns wherever you listen or watch, including YouTube, where we are growing rapidly. Become part of that community of 5,000 plus subscribers. Become an everydayer. Get locked onto your favorite team every day throughout the offseason and beyond. Today, all things Bradley Beal, Mike Prada of The Athletic, a longtime Wizards analyst, observer.
You can say fan. No, you can say fan. Yeah. Yes,
is fan. Here. Mike is the expert on all things Wizards, and I've been wanting to do this show for a while. I've been trying to get this plan with Mike for a bit, and I'm excited to break down where Beal really is, because at least for the past couple of years, people can maybe pretend or go back and watch, synergy tape, but I don't think there's been a lot of eyes on that Wizards team, so it should be fun. Let's start here, Mike.
Oof, not a lot of eyes on that Wizards team. That's
is that
rough.
fair? Am I?
I mean, there are at least two.
Yeah, there you go. Maybe the coaching staff. I would imagine there's at least a certain number of season ticket holders. That
a few, I guess. I mean, they're sort of, let's say they're grandfathered in.
Oh, I forgot to introduce you. I had this in the back of my head as a one-time guest of the Phoenix Suns broadcast as well.
Oh yeah, yeah, that was pretty cool. Those guys are great. Shout out Kevin Ray and Myers Drysdale. That was terrific. I had a great time there.
Yeah, better without Eddie Johnson. In terms of not getting roughed up on live television, I would say
no comment. I think it would have been quite entertaining if he was on. But,
great analyst, but especially given the nature of your book and his philosophies on basketball, I think there might have been some butting of heads.
Maybe, although I think I would have enjoyed it.
I've interviewed Eddie.
I would have loved it. I mean, if Eddie Johnson played in this era, I think he would have loved this era of basketball. Like, that's sort of every single time that someone complains about, I didn't get to play, this era is not as good in any sport. Mm-hmm. It's always like, how like Joe Morgan would have been like perfect for the Moneyball era in baseball after as he was complaining about it all the time. It's the same thing. It always is like this. Eddie Johnson would have slayed in this era.
It's funny. I've interviewed Eddie about that topic because I kind of presented his stats to him like, dude, you were kind of a trailblazer in a way. Like, you were taking those shots, threes, and just sort of expanding your game and being a 3-level scorer when that wasn't necessarily encouraged or in vogue. And how do you hate it now? And his thing, and understandably so, has always been he just doesn't like when players are pigeonholed to be asked to do things that actually make them worse players. And that's a point well taken. But maybe some of that has to do with what we're talking about with Bradley Beal today. Where I was going to start
is just segue.
Been doing it, as I say, at the top 6 years. What was your first reaction when you thought of Beal, the basketball player, ending up on this Suns team?
Definitely a little bit of a strange fit. If only because so often, Beal and Devin Booker have been kind of mentioned as very similar style of players. And I do think there are a lot of similarities between them. There are some subtle differences that may have to be a slightly more than not subtle differences for this all to work, and they could be. But yeah, no, I was definitely a little surprised that that's the direction they went. I think part of it too is that it sort of centers on the theory that when the Suns started to rise, it was the first step that really got them on the path to respectability and beyond was the trade for Ricky Rubio, with the logic being Devin Booker is now our off guard. We are not going to have him play make as much. And now we're kind of going the opposite way. We're saying that's what he's going to do. So yeah, it was a little bit of surprise. I think there was also the sticker shock of like, wow, the Suns are really all in plus here. You sit down and thought about it a little bit more though, and you sort of thought, if the Suns were already all in plus, what could they realistically have done to improve their roster outside of this trade in a meaningful way? You start to run out of ideas at that point. So it started to make a little more sense from there. But, definitely the first reaction was like, wait a minute, like, so how are they going to play together?
Yeah. And we will break that down in pretty close detail as we go here. Keeping big picture, I mean, agreed on the upgrade idea, and just sort of the transaction part of this thing is like, you look at what Chris Paul eventually changed teams again for, and it's like Jordan Poole and Patrick Baldwin probably not, getting the Suns over the hump against Denver, but maybe Beal can. How much should Suns fans actually be worried about kind of this injury and regression talk that's been there with Beal? Because I kind of went through it from the outside view, at least as far as injuries go, at the time of the deal. And it doesn't feel like it's, Kristaps Porzingis or Zion Williamson at all. It's feels random, but am I wrong to think about it that way?
I don't know if it's random because so much of it is related to like his hamstring. But of course, the comparison point is Chris Paul's longevity. And I mean, there's no comparison there, like just because Bradley Beal is not 39. So I think in that respect, I would expect him to miss some games. Some of the part of it too is that actually the fact that it is a lot of nagging issues recently, and not an acute injury, actually to me like sort of underscores that there is an injury risk. So I would be reasonably concerned, but that would have been the case if you acquired any 30-plus-year-old for whatever, and that would have been the case. I mean, Chris Paul is much more of an injury risk. So
sure,
I think in that respect, like you're almost upgrading the injury risk, but I think it would be silly to say it's not there. One thing that I think maybe is slightly encouraging is that 2 years ago, the year that he started the year having the COVID, and there was sort of a vaccine controversy, whatever. That year, he definitely didn't look right even when he was playing. Something did not look right with the way his body movements were working. He wasn't moving in the same way. He wasn't making the same quick cuts. And last year, even though he played only 50 games, and he wasn't as good as he was 2 or 3 years ago, he looked a lot more movement-wise like the Bradley Beal that I remembered from before 2021-22. And I think he played better than the Bradley Beal that I remember than the year before. So just a lot more like sort of sharp cutting, a lot more sort of that like kind of quick off the ball. Like he didn't get to the free throw line as much, but his moves were, I think, a little sharper. There were fewer sort of like he would have these like controller unplugged moments during games in 2021-22 where it was like, do you know how your body works? Like it was very strange looking sort of mishaps, and I didn't see those in the next year. So that, from perhaps an injury perspective, should be encouraging for Suns fans. But I hate to be like glib about it, but everybody's an injury risk once you're, what is he, 29, 30 years old, and you play in the league as long as he has, and you rely a lot on this sort of quick one cut movements. I think it would be foolish to say there's no injury risk. But I mean, it's certainly less, maybe not of a regular season injury risk, but certainly less of a longevity injury risk than Chris Paul. So, which I guess is the germane point of comparison if you throw out just like if you assume that the Suns are not playing for the future anyway.
Sure. Yeah, and on top of being 30 now, also, like 10 seasons in the league, right? So
a lot of playoff runs as well early in his career.
Exactly.
And later.
So there's no version where it's a zero, but I guess I hadn't really necessarily been thinking about it in a comparison to Chris Paul, but that obviously helps.
He's basically replacing Paul on the roster, is he not?
Yeah.
I mean, he's essentially going to slot right into that lineup slot. So I think it's kind of, at least for next year, that is the comparison to make. And
Yep.
look, I think there's a reasonable argument that like Chris Paul was better last year than Bradley Beal.
Hmm.
So maybe he will be again. So I don't know if that's even super clean, but yeah, I mean, I think
All right.
that's the comparison to make for sure.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to transition into more basketball. I will just point out, in terms of kind of the combination of injury and regression and how one affects the other. The year that Mike is talking about, that was the season he shot 30% from deep, which I know has kind of gotten highlighted and circled and gotten some scares from Suns fans and followers locally. That would be part of the explanation. Not exactly a coincidence that the unhealthiest year of your career would be a year where you don't shoot quite as well. But let's transition. I want to ask Mike what the realist, the version of Beal that's closest to reality is of all the different versions we've seen. We'll do that next. First, today's show brought to you by Bird Dogs, which is the best shorts for the Arizona summer. That's what's most relevant to us here. They make you look good. They're designed to fit slimmer through the thigh and leg, giving you that truly sculpted look. So in addition to being stretchy and being comfortable, they also breathe, which again is the most important part for us. They have anti-stink sweat wicking fabric that keeps you cool and dry all day long, unlike the stiff restricting cotton stuff that you can get elsewhere. I'm more of a short inseam type of person, but that's also because I'm not as tall as some. They have longer. They have multiple styles. You can go a style that's maybe for the golf course. You can go a style that is maybe going to look a little nicer if you're actually going out to do something. The pairs that I have are workout sort of gym shorts, as well as, lounge around the house, quick errand type of thing. But no matter what, they look good. They feel good. And again, they breathe. Go to birddogs.com/LockedOnNBA to get a Yeti style tumbler with your first order. So you get the shorts, you get a little something else on top of it. You can also enter the promo code LockedOnNBA checkout. That's birddogs.com/LockedOnNBA or promo code LockedOnNBA at checkout for that free Yeti style tumbler with your first purchase.
I have to admit that I read Tumblr as like the internet website. You get like a free Tumblr.
I think all of those are free. That would be a bad
Right.
giveaway by Bird Dogs.
I was like, wait a minute, because you know how science says that when you actually read a word, you only read the first and last letter, and you fill in the rest.
Same thing.
Mm-hmm.
At this point, though, with the value of that particular website, I think you might actually be able to get the whole thing for free with the purchase at Bird Dogs. So that might be where we are. Let me put that question to you, though, Mike. The version of Beal that you think is closest to reality, the ones that I had listed, and maybe you actually have additional in-between iterations of this guy, but I have John Wall co-pilot in the early years. I have the 30 points per game guy was the name for some of those COVID seasons. And then the lackluster kind of injury riddled past 2 seasons is the 3 that I chunked out. Which of those is the closest to reality, or do you have another one?
I think the simplest answer is the most recent version is the closest to reality. It's just, but I would draw a distinction again between the last 2 years where he was injury prone in both years, but last year I think his production and the way he played was, I think, a lot better than the year before. It was also a little more collaborative. I actually thought he had pretty good chemistry with Kristaps Porzingis when they played. They had some interesting, cool little 2-man actions that they would run. They had a pretty good, like, sort of dribble handoff game. They had a pretty good catch and go game, dribble pitch game, whatever you want to call it. I think that's probably the closest thing. I mean, it's the safe answer because, that's the most recent one. And he doesn't just like devolve his entire body back into 2015 or whatever, like you don't get to be that type of player. Like, I think if Suns fans are expecting that he automatically goes back to the running mate version that has significantly more of his baskets unassisted than assisted, and that's going to be comfortable for him, I just think that's asking a lot. It's not because he has a will to do that, obviously, because he chose to be in Phoenix. But, you can't just like kind of change some of your habits and be a different player. So my guess is that you're going to see something resembling what we saw last year. He doesn't really have like necessarily a dribble handoff partner, But I do think that the presence of Durant and Booker will allow him to play a little more off the ball upon catching it, and he will able to kind of be more of a one-cut player. But I suspect that he will not get to the free throw line as often. I'm not sure that 3-point percentage will go right back up to over 40%. I think it may stay in the mid 30s. I'm not sure. Like, he's not just going to be a guy who stands around. I think there are going to be a lot of pull-up mid-range jumpers, but I think it will look more like last year. And hopefully for Suns fans, it's like last year, but in 65 games instead of, what do you play, 50 games?
Yeah.
So I think that's the simple answer.
So that's one of the things I was going to ask about, because obviously, statistically, you just kind of look at what's evolved over time, and mid-range frequency has gone up, 3-point frequency has gone down a bit. He also has, I would say it feels, statistically, you would look at it and say he's improved as a finisher. So it's not all just sort of taking those less efficient shots and whatnot, but that's an unmistakable trend from him. It sounds like you think that will continue. I'm hopeful that, some of the notes that I have here as far as evolution, which we're going to talk about in the next segment, but I'll get into now, is like, it might not be the same physically for him, or, exactly the same in terms of the makeup of the team, because John Wall is such a unique player. It's never going to be identical to that. But I'm hopeful that something where his off-ball gravity and the way he's able to move and be a threat as a shooter could actually, that really just hasn't been a threat in and of itself in a long time for him, because most of the actions were designed to say, all right, you're going to get it even if you don't start with it, but really you're going to go downhill, or you're going to pull up from mid-range, or maybe you'll shoot a three less often lately. I wonder what it can look like for him to just be a threat and a weapon as far as his gravity goes, and be really used that way. But maybe that's just not in the cards.
Well, I think it could be in the cards. I mean, I agree with you that there's a lot more that can be mined with the way he moves off the ball. To your point, maybe not necessarily to get it. Like, there are ways that he can be used perhaps as a screener, for example, that I think were developed a little bit more last year, again with Porzingis, but there are ways to do that better. To me, the real question is, when you have a situation with the team where you've got three guys who can you could use any of them in any sort, theoretically, in any sort of like ball handler, spacer, decoy combination in Booker, Durant, and Beal. But they're all used to being in one of those roles. They haven't played their whole career really as a spacer, and only briefly as a decoy. I mean, at some point on every play, you have to have one of them fill one of those roles each. There are going to be plays where Kevin Durant is just a decoy. There are going to be plays where Bradley Beal is just a decoy. There are going to be plays where Devin Booker is just a decoy. The challenge you're going to run into if you're Frank Vogel, who frankly is a great coach but has never been known as a creative offensive coach, is how do you make it so that all three of those guys are dynamic in all those plays at the same time, when it's just not been the way they've played? Someone's got to be the great passer, but all three of those guys look to shoot. Someone's got to be a decoy, but they're overqualified to be a decoy. The same way for spacers. So it's going to be, this isn't necessarily a Beal only thing, but I think it applies as much to Beal as it does to Durant and Booker, because all three of those guys have been the main guys. You don't want to have a rigid pecking order, but like on each individual play, you need a pecking order. It may not be the same one every play.
Yeah.
And your options for sort of making it so that the whole is more than some of the parts. One is to play faster. The other is to rebound and defend better, and so you can get out and play faster. And then you also, beyond all that, you also have DeAndre Ayton to feed. I guess the other thing you could do is you could stagger them, their lineups, so that there's a lot of that involved. All I'm saying is that it can happen in some moments, but that's different than saying that it will happen easily in all moments. And I think it may, even though Beal, Durant, and Booker all have the skill sets, I think the mindset shift is going to be a little more challenging than it seems now, even if they get primed together, and even if Beal, as it seems, like is very much embracing that, like, hey, I'm not Kevin Durant or Devin Booker.
Yeah, and that's the thing you would have to take away as far as optimism goes, right? Is that factor of publicly Beal kind of speaking to his eagerness here, and obviously both Durant and Beal have been over the moon about the opportunity to play with Booker and seem to really respect him and kind of think of him as being the top of the pecking order that you were referencing there. And obviously the other part would just be they kept their kind of offensive coordinator in Kevin Young, and that was a big coup for them. And they feel like paying him a lot of money to stay here rather than going to Detroit with Monty Williams or wherever other offers he might have had is going to help them balance the team out, and at least from a coaching and strategy standpoint. Let's just kind of do offense and then defense. I wasn't planning on it that way, but we've spent time on offense already, and I have one more kind of two-prong thing for you, which is how is Beal as a passer? And kind of secondarily to that is just I think staggering them is going to be an obvious way to let everybody eat. And I would even include DeAndre Ayton in that. Frankly, I think kind of playing Ayton more with the bench units is an obvious tweak that Vogel can make compared to Monty Williams. If there is an emphasis on Ayton at least getting a shot attempt or two more than he used to.
Shot attempt more than he used to?
I mean,
let's start
maybe
by
not
getting
more
back
than
to,
he used to.
Let's start by getting back to where he was used to.
Sure. Yes. If there is a goal to get him involved in the offense at all, let me put it that way, it would be most easy to do it off the bench. And I've been wondering about a Beal Ayton bench kind of led bench unit. I think that has to rely on Beal maybe being able to be the primary ball handler in a lineup like that. What is he as a passer? I mean, that's the easiest question.
I'd say he's not as good as Booker. But Booker, I think, as you guys have all pointed out for years, is tremendously underrated in that regard. I think he's improved quite a bit since the start of his career, because I mean, part of the reason there was so much tension between him and Wall is that I think Beal looked at himself and said, "I'm not that dude's sidekick," you know. And I think Wall very much looked at him and said, "You're my sidekick." And so part of that, of course, on the court manifests in who actually gets to make the plays. And so I think there was a lot of incentive for Beal to improve as a playmaker, and he has. I do think that probably not a great thing if he's your primary playmaker. He can get a little, not because he's incapable of making these passes, but he gets a little bit of tunnel vision, particularly when he's trying to force plays. And maybe that instinct will dissipate when he's not the guy who has the supermax $200 million contract and the no trade clause. I guess he still has that, but you know what I mean? Like the guy, he's not the only one who has that, let's say, on the team. So maybe that'll dissipate, but he can certainly make the right reads. I think the question is sort of when it gets tight, he sort of defaults a little bit to like putting his head down, trying to make something happen. And you obviously can't do that on this team. To the plan of sort of whether to play him with Ayton, it depends a lot on sort of, if I were Kevin Young or Frank Vogel, what I would be doing, and I don't know if Ayton has this capability, but I would be trying to explore it, is again, look at what Beal did with Porzingis last year and how that was kind of a little bit more of not a pick and roll game, a two-man game, that there was stuff that they were doing together. They were throwing the ball back to each other, some off-ball movement, a lot of rescreening, a lot of kind of quick hitter type of actions, a lot of help, frankly, Beal screening for Ayton or for Porzingis. To me, that requires a little bit more of sort of some ball skills that we'll see if Ayton has. But if you're going to do that, I think that's sort of more in the vein of what you're looking for, rather than using Beal as kind of like a point guard on the second unit. Like, I think you'd want to play Campaign, or I guess TJ McConnell if they trade for him, or whatever that is. That the new rumor now? I think you'd want to have another ball handler on the floor to make that maximize that. Is my read on it. And again, like when they're playing together, Devin Booker should be the one who's making the tougher passes for this to work. And that is going to be interesting because, again, like we talked about, the whole theory of Devin Booker was let's limit his playmaking options at the beginning of this whole Monty Williams era, or maybe going back and it is the right move. I don't know, but that's a change. So it asks a lot of him.
Yeah, it definitely does. I think they came to a realization maybe during the playoffs last year that, that step in his development, that box had been checked, and maybe it was time to return to,
Mm-hmm.
a different role, doing more. I hear you, and I do want to emphasize too the other part of the sacrifice and some of the adjustments that are obviously going to have to be made in style and in mindset and everything else. Another point I've been making is one you just made. They've all gotten paid, right? This is not an opportunity where one of the guys is young and he kind of is hungry for the bigger thing and the bigger contract and whatever. I'm not saying that makes everything go over perfectly, but that is a concern that probably this team won't have, outside of, I guess, Ayton is still kind of figuring out what that's going to be for him.
Might be a problem for Ayton more so than anything.
Yeah. Another area, though, where Booker might be asked to do too much, a lot, whatever you want to look at it as, is defense. So let's switch over to that end of the floor. We'll get the abbreviated scouting report on Beal as a defender and kind of talk through some of the permutations of how the Suns could deploy him next. First, today's show brought to you by FanDuel. FanDuel Sportsbook is your best place to bet on anything, but especially right now, MLB. 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets right now, up to $200 at the FanDuel Sportsbook. That's right. Just bet $20 and you'll land $200 back in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 you can spend betting everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think is going to hit the first home run, all on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. Deposit that right back into your account with those winnings. And there's no better place to bet than, again, FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Sign up today. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/LockedOn for $200 in bonus bets. FanDuel, an official partner of Major League Baseball. All right, let's close things out. Mike, can you just give me kind of the 1 or 2 minute scouting report on Beal as a defender at this point in his career?
He's someone who has not been held accountable for his ability to defend for a very long time. And so it's very hard to know if he is incapable or unwilling. It's hard to separate those two. There are matchups that I think he really gets up for. So I think there is a capability certainly on the ball. And when he was a much younger player, this was some of his ability to defend and rebound and do some of these other things was very much a strength of his. So it's certainly conceivable that he can hold his own. And I think Booker is a better defender, though.
Sure.
The other question I think that is worth asking about Beal in defense is that he is among the worst, or at least he was with the Wizards, among the worst transition defenders in the league. He's among the type of people who sort of, he'll complain about call. He'll be slow to get back. He'll, again, kind of lose focus. Again, there is a reasonable argument to be made that was a product of what he believed to be his role, and his importance to the offense, and his sort of, again, lack of accountability because he was the franchise superstar that may dissipate in Phoenix, but it's also been a long time. So I don't know if those habits will die easily. I think Chris Paul is a better regular season defender. I mean, the one thing you can say about Beal is that he probably won't be targeted in the same way that Chris Paul was against bigger players in the playoffs. I think that's a defensive downgrade. In general, it is possible that I think that Beal will get up for the big matchups. I think Vogel will smartly deploy him. He's pretty good at sort of that type of thing. But again, I think this asks a lot of Booker to take on assignments that he was frankly taking on already.
Sure.
Like
in the biggest matchups, like you just said. Yeah.
In the biggest matchups. So it is just sort of funny to me how like you've got these great players coming together, and it is a great perimeter trio. And yet so much of its success relies on, to me at least, Devin Booker being the best player of the three.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I don't necessarily have that much hesitancy to say that he will be. It's more to me like how many different things can he be the best at, right?
Exactly. That's exactly it.
That's kind of the issue. I mean, with Beal, my thing is kind of looking at some of the underlying stats, and obviously just sort of, 6'4" with the 6'8" wingspan and everything else. I wonder if he might actually be their starting lineup point of attack defender more so than
who else will be?
Well, it could be Booker, right? But
yeah,
I think that it seems like he's better doing that. You know, if you're facing Damian Lillard or Kyrie Irving or whatever, and it's probably smartest to just start him on those guys and create a scheme that understands that he's maybe not going to halt their drive or kind of snatch the ball out of their hands every time, but he can maybe stay with them and at least put up some sort of fight. I think the reason that this question matters, Mike, is who the fifth starter is for the Suns.
Well, see, that's part of it, though. I think the real answer to your question is the fifth starter will guard those guys.
So that's what's interesting, right? Because if it's Josh Okogie, if it's Josh Okogie, he will.
Mm-hmm.
If it's somebody like Keita Bates-Diop and they really want to go kind of big, and I know a lot of Suns fans are intrigued by the possibility of it being him and maybe being a little more switchable defensively or allowing yourself to just have more size, then maybe he's not going to guard Damian Lillard, right? It probably would be Beal or Booker in that case. So
might be. I mean, the one thing that might give Suns fans some hope, and again, it is it's been a while, but a lot of times back in the Wall Beal days, the Wizards would kind of deploy Beal as kind of more of the clamp defender and Wall as more of the roamer in this sort of setup. So it even though Wall had the better defensive reputation, he was kind of more used as like the guy to get highlights or the guy to roam or the guy to kind of guard it didn't really have as much of the like sort of let's guard the non-threat on purpose, but they would sometimes in high leverage matchups use Beal as a way to hide Wall or to limit his responsibility. And Beal is much better than Wall was at clamping down on one guy. So I think that we will see that. And I think that may work as a decent failsafe. I don't know if that was a long time ago that Beal did that.
Yeah.
So, but I think it is a decent fail-safe option. And, truthfully, it's probably better to do that for him than to sort of say, hey, you guard the non-threat, Brad, and you help off the ball. Because I do think he gets lost. And again, we'll see if that gets solved a little bit by lower usage, but I would not automatically assume that it does, is all I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, they were top 10 defense for the first few years of his career. I mean, very, very different league and sport back then, but it obviously is there. I think the part of it that I've wondered about or that maybe worries me the most, thinking about what this team can be defensively, even if a lot of these things we're talking about kind of click in an ideal way, is it doesn't feel like strength is necessarily his strong suit as a defender. And if you're talking about switching more, or if you're talking about matchup situations where he ends up guarding somebody who is a little more overpowering, I don't know if you can put him in those spots and feel good about it.
Well, what's interesting is that as an offensive player, Beal's strength is one of his big strengths, particularly his strength on the move and his strength to explode through, or at least it was one of his strengths before 2021. I mean, I know I wrote a whole piece about this on the newsletter that I used to have, his ability to kind of jump out and explode through guys. So there is a blueprint for where his strength could matter on defense. Like he's a pretty thick guy. This could sound really like that's what she said, but whatever. I think you know what I'm trying to say.
Yes.
He's got, I'm not even gonna say it. Just let it live. You know what I mean.
Yes.
But he has that. You're right. He hasn't really used it a ton on defense, but he could. So I actually think there is potential there. I think the bigger issue with the switching stuff, I think, is more so. I mean, I wrote about this in the book, and I think it's something that people often forget with switching. Is like every time you switch, you're making an active maneuver to switch. It's an active maneuver that you can screw up, and I just don't like. Does he have the concentration to switch all the time? Like, and to do it at the right time and to have the mental aptitude to like switch at the right moment, the lack of a mental load or fatigue or whatever to switch at the right moment and like kind of cover up a slip, or is there going to be miscommunication plus experience? To me, that is more of an issue than can he hold up guarding? I mean, not Jokic. He's like sort of another, like, can he hold up guarding? I don't know. Jaren
LeBron.
Jackson, Jaren
Yeah.
Jackson, the post.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think
Yeah,
of like
sure.
not LeBron, not a superstar, but that I think is maybe a little less of an issue for me. It's more so just the kind of the active maneuver of switching and how that can be coordinated and how much focus that requires that I would be worried about.
Yeah, I mean, I think the same concern would be there from a processing standpoint and the big adjustment that it would be for Booker and Ayton. I mean, those, even at their best moments, those are guys who do make mistakes, do lose track of where they're kind of supposed to be and what their job is in a given millisecond. You know what I mean? So I don't, and Frank Vogel's never done that, right? I mean, even with kind of the Swiss Army knife that is Anthony Davis, he never went to like fully switch everything at all times, like, the Rockets with James Harden. It was selective, or it was against one action or one player or whatever the case was. I think we could see that. The more I think about it, especially now that we've seen how they filled out the roster, though, I think it's going to be maybe an aggressive version of a basic scheme, a drop
that's what I would think too.
Length and size, right? And just more swarming help than maybe Monty was willing to do, especially with some of their reserve players. But I don't think we're going to see a reinvention of NBA defense with this team, even if DeAndre Ayton theoretically could be a part of a system like that or whatever. Not to mention, when we do get back to the physical part of it, you don't exactly want Kevin Durant in those spots either.
There are a lot of guys you want to avoid the toll of having to guard a lot of big players on this roster.
Yep. Exactly.
It's hard to prevent three superstars from taking on that load.
Yes.
That's why super teams often don't work.
Well, great note to end the show on. That will do it for us. You can check out everything going on at the Athletic NBA. Mike has a role in all of that. You can check out his book Spaced Out, which is fundamental to kind of getting what all this is about in the modern NBA and kind of how offense and defense have evolved as the league has embraced the space of the court and everything that goes with that. Think I'm going to do a bonus episode for you guys on some of the other stuff going on in Suns world. There was a feature about James Jones and Matt Ishbia at ESPN today, and as Mike referenced a minute ago, the TJ McConnell rumors. So that will probably be in your feeds by the time that this one is. So listen to that, hit follow or subscribe, get this show in your feed every single day throughout the offseason and beyond. And I'll catch you guys next week.